Rebecca, thank you for joining today to chat about detecting deception. So for the students that don't know you, do you want to give us a little bit of your background and talk a little bit about also your PhD and what you're looking at?
So you're more than welcome, Nathan. As you know, this is my favourite topic. Every question usually turns into a mini TED Talk. So my background is in, I did do my honours in forensic psychology. I did an EEG countermeasure lie detection study. As you know, we've written a paper on EEG lie detection for the Australian Police Journal. I am, currently doing my PhD, the world's longest one. I think I've been going for about 5 years now, on lie detection. So it's in forensic psychology on lie detection. It's I did start out to do more EEG studies, but when I came to CQU, I changed it, focusing a little bit more on behavioural lie detection, which has led me to the very sad conclusion that so much of what we do and have done in the past with behavioural measures of lie detection is inaccurate, and worse, it's dangerous. It's led to innocent people being incarcerated. So I spend a lot of time at the moment being a myth buster, and I intend to go back to the EEG later on. We don't have an EEG on the Townsville campus, but when the PhD is finished, I intend to go back to doing more EEG work, perhaps fly down to Adelaide where they've got the sleep centre and all the EEG set up. So I teach into social foundations of psychology. I'm the unit coordinator for that. However, I have worked tutoring every undergrad psychology class here on Townsville. And I've been at this Townsville campus for a bit over 4.5 years, going on 5 years.
Wow. So part of the furniture now at Townsville, really.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm the uni mum at Townsville.
Yes. So no doubt some of the students will have had you teach them at times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it sounds as though lie detection and detecting deception is a very problematic area from what you're saying. And I guess to put some context around it, it seems as though we've got a couple of different scenarios. So one might be in the context of a police interview where the police are looking at essentially the information, whether it's verbal or non-verbal, that the suspect is giving off or saying. And then the other aspect, I guess, is in the psychological context in terms of things such as risk assessments and making judgments about essentially about the individual that's being assessed. And then probably the other aspect as well, that's probably the culmination of both of those, is then when it progresses to court and we have jurors looking at the offender or the defendant, and they're making a decision about the individual's guilt based on the information that's coming across in the case. But often they are watching the person and looking at their behaviour, and they're making judgments about the person. So we have, in many ways, when we're thinking about detecting deception and lies, it's an enormous area that underpins in very much most of forensic psychology. So we're essentially, when it comes to making inferences about whether someone has or hasn't done something, that's essentially what detecting deception is relating to. And it's a big field, and we'll talk about really the breadth of different approaches and technologies to being able to determine whether someone's telling the truth. And some of that dates back to rice eating activities back in China many centuries ago, all the way through to the current developments now, which we'll touch on as well. And we've recently done that paper together on brain fingerprinting. So it's a very, very broad area. We've had sort of a basket full of different techniques and approaches. And I guess the big question is any of it effective? But for you in your studies and across looking at the different approaches, is there any that have stood out for you over the history of lie detection?
I think what stands out most for me, this is why we're such a good pair to have this, because Nathan, you look at it from a professional, so you're obviously overqualified, having a master's and being practicing forensic psychologist and a PhD, but you probably look at that as someone who's in there making the decisions. Whereas I come at it from more of a juror's point of view. So I'm just looking at the regular person, and being a regular person, being as I'm not a practicing psychologist, I'm looking at it more from that point of view. However, having delved into the history of it and where we've gone, the most striking thing to me is I think that so much of what we're doing, we're actually looking at the same thing, we just don't realize it. I think we're doing the same thing as they did with the 1000 BC rice chewing. It's based on the same thing, we just don't realize it. In the US, I can't remember what first started, maybe in 2013, 2014, they spent $900 million on this spot program at the airports. And they've spent millions and millions on these behavioral indicators or these high scientific things where they've got these lasers that can tell the heat coming from your face. And it sounds very technological and very advanced, but what it is, it's connected to fear. How many heaps and heaps of people at airports, for one, you get nervous when you get questioned. If you don't, as you know, Nathan, it's a good chance you're a psychopath. And that makes you heaps more dangerous than everybody else. Two, a lot of people are scared of flying. Now, if you're doing anything, doesn't matter, oh, wow, it's this amazing laser and it'll pick up the, and they'll talk about, all the facial structures and the veins, and we've got this and the nerves, and it sounds very scientific. But what it is, it's fear, and it's raising, the heat that you're emanating from your body. And that's the exact same thing as rice chewing. It just sounds more. So that has been the most amazing thing I have found. I keep going through all these different ways of detecting lies, and as it got more scientifically advanced, it's based on the same thing. The problems are made because of fear. So we all know that when our fight or flight, so any technology or anything that could also be picking up that flight response, that fear response, is actually the same thing. And that's the problem with the polygraph, as you know. So the most amazing finding to me is we are probably testing the same thing.
So and it sounds like a large part of what you're saying is that baseline behavior, well, that's, I guess the assumption is that first of all, they've taken the baseline behavior and they understand what baseline behavior looks like, but that behavior is then changing as a result of fear rather than as a result of lying. And I think that is a huge point amongst this whole field and this whole section of the field is, yes, how do you get ultimately to the core of what is driving that behavior? Is it being driven by the intent to deceive, or is it being driven by emotion? And then there's a whole different range of behaviors that can arise, whether it's anxiety or fear that's driving the behavior, but it can really lead to people engaging in abnormal and unusual behaviors in the situation. And that is largely arising because of situational factors in the context that's being created. But I guess across the different approaches throughout the years, is there any techniques that stand out for you? So I guess we've started with the idea of the rice chewing, and then we've even had things such as pulling the donkey's tail, and then we've had what we know it now as the polygraph. I think it was earlier. I think it earlier emerged in the early 1900s, and then it was later changed to become the polygraph. And now we move towards other aspects such as looking at facial expressions. And now we've gone even further where really now it's moved more away from, well, people observing behavior to being very much heavily technology based. And I think that is something that we'll certainly touch on towards the latter part of our discussion around what all the technology changes mean. But yeah, any techniques for you that stand out and you think that we need to flag as either potentially effective or problematic throughout history?
So cognitive load is very well supported. So it is draining to lie, because the indicators are from brain imaging research that if I ask you a question about something and you intend to lie about, your brain will immediately recall that. So it's sort of like I don't want to ruin everyone's day by making them think of a pink elephant. But if I say to you, don't think of a pink elephant, that's what you think of. If you have committed a crime last Sunday, and I say to you, what did you do last Sunday? Your brain will, you've got this memory trigger, okay, so you will think of it. So if you're going to lie to me about it, that will be immediately triggered. What happened? Because I've mentioned it. If I say to you, Nathan, how was your wedding day? Straight away, you're remembering out all the details about your wedding day. So you have to, that comes up. Now, you're going to have to compress that. You're going to have to be very cognizant of the fact that you don't accidentally tell me anything about it. You are going to have to, something serious, you have no doubt rehearsed the lie or your alibi. You're going to, it takes a lot of cognitive effort. And this is supported by brain imaging research. It takes a lot of cognitive effort to do that, to lie. Whereas if I say to you, what did you do last Sunday? That's going to take some cognitive effort, but you're mainly, at least in a low stake situation, you're just going to focus. You're just going to sit there and think, okay. So it'll take some cognitive effort, not as much. So brain fMRI studies show that when we lied, there were 14 areas of brain activation. And when we told the truth, there were 7. So brain imaging supports this cognitive load theory, which comes from John Sweller in the 80s, Australian, 1980s. He's an educational psychologist. And he wrote this whole book on it and did all this research. And it was for teaching. So, and it was like, don't add on too much. So if I'm talking to you and I've got a board and I've got some virtual background, I've got a kid bouncing off the walls, that's cognitively loading and you won't learn as well. Lie detection, particularly Albert Bry, who's big in the field, they took that and had a look at it lying. And it was sort of just a theory that it's more cognitively draining, but brain imaging research backs it up. Now, there are certain things we do when we're cognitively loaded. And one of those things is we'll sort of freeze up. So we will avert our gaze, which, as you know, is huge because people think that's the number one thing people think when you're lying. You avert your gaze. So naturally, when you're cognitively loaded, your body will freeze up, particularly the upper part. You will look away to something that is not visually stimulating. And that is one fairly good indicator. Another indicator can be that people will stare directly at you because they will try to appear honest. The problem with that is, so they're good indicators. The problem with that is if you are being honest and you are really trying to tell me every detail of what happened, you can also perform behaviours that people think are lying, like gaze aversion is correlated with cognitive load. So, but that is one, if you have got someone who is like overcompensating and staring directly at you, staring too much, that can be an indicator. But if somebody is really frozen, another one is if their stories are too consistent. So if someone's telling you something, which is unfortunately, police look for inconsistencies. So if you tell me, I say, what did you do last Sunday? And you tell me the story, and then next week I say, what did you do the Sunday before last? When you understand how memory works, you have a bit of deterioration. People's stories who are overly consistent, that can be an indicator that they're lying because they've rehearsed it. So there are things, unfortunately, they're the opposite to what people think. But yeah, that cognitive load is very well supported. So if you add extra cognitive load to someone who's already cognitively loaded from lying, they may slip up.
Mm.
So if I add in cognitive load, if I get you to hold eye contact with me, that can add the cognitive load and you can slip up. So there are a few behavioural indicators. The problem with behavioural indicators, as you know, anybody who's clever can look them up. And it's hard. But I know you and I differ a little bit on micro expressions. Did you want to talk about that? Because that works, but I think it only works in people that aren't the sharpest tools in the shed. So
Yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, so micro expressions is the idea. Well, first of all, it's the idea that essentially you can split the face in half. So for a true emotional expression, it will need to be mirrored in the top half and the bottom half of the face. For if you're truly happy, you'll see it in the eyes, the eyebrows, and of course you'll also see it in the mouth. Now, if someone's feigning an emotion, so essentially faking an emotion, it'll only be displayed on one half of the face. So either the top half or the bottom of the face. So there's some thinking around, and most of this has been largely initially developed by Paul Ekman. And I think certainly from developing an understanding about emotions and how humans express them, Paul Ekman's work is fantastic on that level. The next step and the next jump is then, can we take away and make conclusions about the consistency of that emotion, and does it apply in high stakes and high pressure contexts? So do we still get those consistent findings and consistent results and consistent type of emotional expression occurring in stressful environments when someone is put in a position of fear? Now, the thinking behind essentially emotional leakage, or what we'd also term as these small indicators or micro expressions, is that they're about a 1/25th of a second, very small, quick micro expression. And we were talking before about the documentary, I think it was documentary series Crocodile Tears, and then you can also see many clips on YouTube where people are denying having committed crimes, particularly when children go missing and parents get on TV and do interviews, and they'll be professing their distress, and there will certainly be inconsistencies in what they're saying, and we look at whether the verbal content matches the non-verbal behavior. But generally, when it comes to micro expressions, there tends to be roughly an agreed upon 7 types of universal emotions. So we have happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise, and our last one, which is very interesting, and I think this is probably the one that I think is the most powerful micro expression, is contempt. And we really see that emerge in our narcissistic, psychopathic individuals, where it's the I am smarter than you, and they can't help but leak an emotion or leak that feeling of contempt. And it's that satisfaction essentially of triumphing the other person, but it also shows their disdain and also dislike towards that person. So it's separate from disgust, because it's more of this arrogant sense of strong emotion and superiority that is directed towards the individual. So there's really been interesting research around micro expressions, and Stephen Porter's done some really good research around identifying those in different studies and also in high stakes situations. My feeling about it is, though, my impression is that it is prone to being somewhat subjective. And I think the only way that you could reliably do that would be to have a video camera in the police interview, where you would then essentially afterwards go back, re-watch the interview and pick moments in that interview where potentially there's a micro expression that has come up. Trying to do it in a live, real life situation is very risky. It's likely that you may, first of all, misidentify what the emotion is. It might not even be a micro expression, but if you can slow it down, re-watch that in a video scenario and identify the moments, particularly if it's around a very potent or topical issue that's being discussed, such as, where is the body, or, what happened in the argument with that person, then I think there's certainly really good utility for them. But again, is it indicating that the person is lying? That's a question mark. And I would say that we would say there's an inconsistency there. And I think the crux of all of the techniques, well, not all the techniques, but the useful techniques that do work, is we pick up inconsistencies. It's not conclusive that the person's lying. So we're saying that there's an emotional mismatch between what is being discussed and the non-verbal behavior that they're showing. And that then allows you to narrow down on the issue and then delve further into why there is this mismatch and inconsistency. But can you conclusively say that they're lying? Well, it's a pretty bold move, and it's a risky move, because then we go down the path, don't we, Rebecca, of potentially false confessions or miscarriages of justice. And we've certainly seen that over the years, where wrong assumptions are made.
Yeah, because you'd have to, I tend to agree with you with the contempt thing. I think you may be a lot less likely to see contempt with someone who's in fight flight, because they're in protective mode. They would, to get to that fight flight, you would already feel that this person can do you harm, that this situation, so you may be a lot less likely to display contempt because you're afraid. So if you had that superiority, I'm smarter than you attitude, as you would know with all the research with psychopaths, they're usually not afraid. They think they're smarter than you, and they think that they're right. So I would agree with that. The problem I have is, what about people who, for religious reasons, personal experience, ethnicity, which is huge, we're all watching it play out with the Black Lives Matter movement. We're talking about people who have pure contempt for the police force. Does that mean they're lying, or does it mean that they think they're scum? And so you're going to look at them like, and then, as we know, with terrorists and with people of very different beliefs, and look at a Westerner and a Western police officer, and with just disgust and contempt for who they are. So does that mean what they're saying is lying? And this abnormal emotion. So I watched an interview, which I found, it was horrible, but just fascinating. There was a lady in New Zealand, and her sister had been murdered, and she flew there. And I wish I could have recorded it. I just saw it on the news. They were giving an interview with her, and she was laughing. She was saying, oh, she's always been the favourite, and my parents are just distraught. I don't think they'll survive because this, she's the favourite, and she's giggling. if she was in a situation where she was a suspect, I truly believe the police would hone in on her, because that is not an appropriate response. And it was the same with the little girl that, oh my goodness, I can't remember her name now, who was found in the cellar of the parents' home on Christmas Day. She got stolen. Oh, she was apparently kidnapped, and they thought the parents had done it. The name's just escaped me now. Dr. Phil did an interview with her brother, who a lot of people had thought that he'd killed her. And he was sort of smiling through the interview.
So John Benet Ramsey?
That's it. Sorry, yeah. I don't know how.
Yeah.
I didn't remember that. Yeah, John Benet Ramsey.
Very unusual interview.
Yeah, and but that doesn't mean people can do the most bizarre things when they're under enormous stress. We don't know. Lindy Chamberlain, the Court of Appeals, of Public Appeal, because she did not act as people think a mother should act. And if we don't understand, like a lot of people who are, are very religious, and I've spoken to people who've one lady in particular who lost her child, and she's very religious. And if you come across and listen to someone, if you're not religious, they can come out and say, well, it's God's will. And you can think, oh, that sounds dodgy. So we don't know. And even when we talk about someone's baseline, which, I know that that's what a lot of officers will look at, and it's the polygraph. Okay, we'll have a chat to you. Okay, what's your name? Where do you live? What do you do? Okay, let's look at the baseline with an interview. And then, okay, did you kill your child? And now everything, the behaviour's different, but the question's different. So, yeah, that turned into a rant about behaviour. But, yeah, there's just so many issues with it. However, I will say that I think the contempt is the most likely, because it doesn't really correlate with fear. But it can. If you despise the police, you despise the ideology of the person you're talking to, I think it'd make for an interesting study, wouldn't it? To see if we do see contempt from innocent people in a high stakes situation. But I think we would find it. So
yes, and I think, yeah, you're making some good points there, and one of them is, for example, throughout a police interview, looking at broad conclusions about the person. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down. And for me, it's around essentially narrowing it down to context and questions. So I think it's targeting, or I think it's making your judgments about whether the person is providing an inconsistent response to very select contextual situations within an interview. So that might mean that you're building up to a 5-minute window where you have very targeted questions, and that is the focus of the behavior in that situation. But if you're making broader conclusions across their behavior throughout the whole interview in terms of things like their eye contact, etc., that's really dangerous. And that's where we have seen certainly a lot of issues arise, and also false confessions and things along those lines. So it really needs to be context specific. It needs to be focused to a set of specific questions. And I think then you can look at making some conclusions from that. But again, they're working hypotheses. They're not absolute conclusions. So it's looking at, is there any inconsistencies in this small segment that we've just examined? And if there is, then you can narrow down on that further. But if you're trying to take conclusions away from a 2-hour interview where behavior, anxiety, emotion will fluctuate, different levels, different rates, the person will be consistent and inconsistent at different points in time, really, it's a flip of the coin whether any conclusion that you'll make will be accurate or not. So I think that's the big problem that we have here, is it's looking at often whole interrogations. You're making assumptions based on the behavior across the whole course of it, rather than isolating it to a few relevant moments, relevant questions in the interview, and narrowing down on what the behavior was in that. So, one of the ones recently I've looked at is Lance Armstrong. And if you look at isolated incidents of Lance Armstrong, when he's answering certain questions in relation to basically his doping. So he's a former cyclist who won 7 Tour de France's and ended up being found to be doping for all of them. And if you look at that, there's certainly emotional inconsistency. So there are times when he is smirking after having just defended or denied that he's doping. And it's that contempt that leaks through, and that sense of confidence. The other side of it is the counter-attack. So he will go on the attack to attack the person that's doing the questioning. So it's a defensive response. But again, is it conclusive? Not necessarily, but you need to try and then unpack, why is this person coming back with an aggressive reaction to this question? They're putting up a defense. Now, what role is that defense playing? Is that defense playing a form of self-protection, or is that defense a wall because that's where they're drawing the line in the sand, and it's about not letting the questions get any closer? If I put up enough walls, then the person can't get to the truth. So it's again, like with the idea of micro expressions, understanding the reactions that the person has when they're questioned is also important. But the conclusions need to be, again, working hypotheses. But there's certainly been interesting things if we look at his behavior, where he went to great lengths to basically destroy, through essentially lawsuits, anyone that challenged him. So it was really what we might say is an overcompensation, going above and beyond that. And that's interesting as well. So we can look at what the subsequent behavior is in response to that, because that can also reveal information. So it's not always the behavior that's occurring in the isolated interview context. It can be the actions that subsequently arise from the interviewing or the questioning as well. So probably one of the ways to then look at this is, we do develop working hypotheses. We're looking for inconsistencies, but we could never reliably say that one method is perfect or concrete or definitive. And that's probably really what, Rebecca, you've been getting at, is that there's caution that's needed. We look at unusual situations as well, like cultural issues that arise, context of terrorism and things like that, where there is such disdain and disgust and anger and contempt towards authorities as well. And again, in those situations, well, first of all, it's about actually acknowledging that this is an unusual situation. Any idea around baseline behavior has to be thrown out. So really, you would want an expert in those cultural areas, or in terrorism, or in radicalization or radicalized behavior, to understand, where does all this behavior fit that the person's presenting with? Is it consistent with having a radicalized identity, having those sorts of beliefs and ideologies? So no approach fits all. That's probably the key message, but it is very much a cautious approach that we do need to take to detecting deception, particularly from what we're talking about in that police interviewing context. Is there anything else that you think is worth adding to that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I know I come across as really negative all the time, because I think, but there's this problem, but there's this problem. But it's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at everything. Like when we talk about, sort of being a bit combative, the McCanns and everything, you can see that they've got, but this is people that have been slammed. You did it, you're a bad parent. No doubt they were thinking, they would have been filled, any decent parent would be filled with angst about leaving those kids there, and that'll torture them, no doubt. And you get this sort of wall and you can see it. But like I say, we all know a politician who loves this. The best form of defense is attack. So if I'm talking to someone about something and they are attacking me and going around the issue, I mean, those things, as you know, they're indicators something's going on. I asked you, what were you doing? And you attacked me. You know, and you want to talk about everything else but what we want to talk about. It's not to say that nothing works. It's just, I think you need to look at it all, and you very much need to take, it's not a broad brushstroke. Okay, if you touch your nose, you're lying. You just can't do it. We're all very, very individual. We've all got our own histories, our own experiences, our own cultural, religious backgrounds, everything. All of these things come to play. You see it with what's happening in the US. There's contempt for the police. It's justified. There's, you know, distrust. It's justified. We've all seen it. Due to the internet, we've seen it. I saw last night, and then a man with a bag over put his bag over his head. We've all seen, you know, the George Floyd. We've seen that. That would make, if I was an African American there, I would have contempt as well if that happened in my city. So we need to look at this person, not if he touches his nose. There's a former CIA agent, you can find it on YouTube, it's had like 7 million views. She says, if you shake your foot in the first 10 seconds of her asking you a question, you are lying. That is dangerous. But it's not to say that there's not, we need to be, you know, anybody who's doing this, you need to check yourself, check your own biases. We've all got them. Police have a lie bias. Regular people have a truth bias. We'll assume what everyone tells us is true. Police have a lie. I think when you're in a jury situation, you're probably switching to a lie bias. I suspect when you're doing a lie detection study, you've probably got a lie bias because you're looking for lying. So it's not to say things wouldn't work, but it is to say you need to treat everyone as an individual and check yourself and check that you're not looking for things that aren't right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, you know, you make some good points about the role of biases, because, you know, generally humans are not the greatest lie detectors, and we've certainly seen some very interesting research on that, and it enters somewhat into the psychopathy field around, you know, why are psychopaths so successful at being able to manipulate others? Well, because generally by nature we're trusting, we don't tend to assume the worst of people. If we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's been beneficial to work as a collective, to work with others, to have trust in the person that's next to you, and that essentially that's often been key to survival. But psychopaths are kind of, in many ways, the one exception to that rule, and they're the person that does have that, in many ways, that Machiavellian type of exploitiveness to them, where they won't be the person that wants to work together. They'll be the person that's looking for the weakness and the gap to exploit, rather than everyone else who generally is very much assuming that, you know, the person next to them can be trusted. And when we get to why are we so bad, well, that's part of it. And the other part that probably has developed over the years is that we determine whether someone is trustworthy based on all the wrong information. And I think that's partly now, from an evolutionary perspective, yes, there's a role to this, but I also think through what has been expressed in the media over the years, there's an element of what is desirable in a person. So it's desirable to be good looking, to be wealthy, to dress well. So all of these features have been sold to us, without going too much down the conspiracy line or anything along those lines. But we've been sold, but also led to believe that these are images of what successful is. And with successful comes trust. And often we see that, a little bit with what Rebecca's talking about with some of the issues that have happened in America, you know, at times there's certainly been class divisions, and often, you know, the middle class or the whatever the next class is, the wealthy class, are seen to be more trustful. And we often see that there's a lot of stigma that's projected towards people that are in a lower class. And there's so many stigmas and stereotypes that emerge around the type of person that would be considered a criminal. You know, it's often someone that is unattractive, that doesn't hold eye contact, that maybe is less intelligent, that doesn't have a job. Then sometimes we also see in places like America, then there is racial aspects that are thrown on top of that stigma as well. So we get stereotypes and stigmas that funnel our beliefs around who is actually trustworthy. So we then start to make these very, very faulty assumptions around whether we can in fact trust someone. So the problem with that is, though, that because we are wired towards survival and wanting to have really a tribe around us that we can trust, once we initially believe that someone's trustworthy, then that person tends to become more likable or more trustworthy moving forward. So if you get past the first impression test, then essentially you're safe. We believe that that person is okay, we can trust them, they're likable, and I can, you know, give them a level of confidence in my life moving forward. Again, the same issue. If you present with a bad first impression, you know, if you're a bit hungover, or if you smell, or denying your shirt that day, whatever it might be, then we might be a bit cautious about that person. And the problem is, we will stay cautious about that person. There's something that I just don't like about them. So,
which we think is our gut instinct
yes,
speaking to us.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that it's a huge thing, and racism is huge in Australia. There's no point in saying it's not. So we're going to have that in the most dangerous of impressions, that implicit one, when we think we're not racist, but we are. And even if it's racism, it's not a do harm, it's a fear racism, and it's a distrust. So we're going to get that implicit impression. We're sitting on a jury, the person comes up, we look at them, unemployed, different race, different religion. So I've worked in the past in a multi-faith chaplaincy at a university, and we worked with families of Muslim students, the horrific things that have happened to them. So we're going to look at that straight away. I think if you put someone on up accused of something, and like they are of the Muslim faith, a lot of people are going to think terrorists. So we have these impressions, and I think the most dangerous ones are implicit. And the studies have shown that, fMRI studies, we can think we're not, don't have any biases, but we do. So what you say, so if I commit a crime, I'm more likely to be believed. I'm white, I'm educated, I teach psychology, you know, I'm a grandma. All of those things don't tie in with what our impression of like a murderer looks like. So it is so much with this lie detection, it's about ourselves, and that's a natural thing. Like you say, if we distrusted everybody, that's it. If we could tell when people were lying to us, when I say to you, oh, Nathan, do you like this piece that I wrote? And you said, no, Beck, I think it's absolute crap. I've read better from a first year. That's not going to work with our working relationship. So if I could tell every time somebody said something to me, if I said to a student, did you enjoy the class? And they said, it was absolute rubbish, most boring thing I've ever sat through. It just doesn't help. So we need our people. We need to be trusting, but we need our people. So we've got all those things, as you know. Oh, you look like me. Oh, you're the same religion as me. You're in the same field as me. I trust you. I didn't need to get to know you when you came to work here. You're in the same field as me. You're so qualified. You're practicing and you've got a PhD. So you're like the most qualified person I've met in forensics. Straight away, I think, I can believe everything you say. You could say to me, do you want to come to my place and buy some Tupperware? And I'd go, wow. In my head, I'd be thinking, I didn't know Tupperware was so great. It must be great. Nathan said it. So yeah, we have all those things, but when we don't know we have it, and police have it, and jurors have it. So we've got that distrust thing that is an implicit impression, and we're not aware of it, and that's going to affect our decisions and what we think of people, and it's going to bias us against people of a different, or someone who's religious talking to someone who's not religious, who's an atheist. Every student listening to this now has had their impressions changed of them because they've gone from whatever it was they did before to now when people ask them, I'm a psychology student. We all know that. When you start, people think you can read their minds. People think you're probably really kind, and they start telling you all their problems. They think you're intelligent. So they've changed their impressions people have of them because of what they do. And the biggest problem is if we don't realize that we have these things, we can assume someone's lying before they even open their mouths. We can assume what they're going to say is a lie because, as you said, we don't trust them. But we don't trust them because of these things. And people will say, oh, it's my gut. It's my intuition. No, it's not. It's an implicit impression a lot of times.
Yes, and in that context as well, if you're already viewed to be lying before you've actually even started to talk, that is very, very worrying. And it also would influence the weight that is placed on the information that you say. So someone from, say, a wealthy class may say the similar information, but the level of weight and skepticism about that won't be there. And there's a couple of things, I guess, with what you're saying. Is part of it is around this attributional bias and confirmation bias. Essentially, we look for things that are consistent with our beliefs and then attribute things that are inconsistent or that don't align, basically as a result of other people, or it's because of them rather than it has anything to do with us. And when we think about that from the context of making decisions about whether someone's telling the truth, yes, certain groups are at a big disadvantage. The other side of it is as well that we need to trust because, as we were saying before, it's beneficial to our psychological well-being, because you could imagine if we were all distrustful. So with distrust tends to come a level of paranoia, suspicion, and of course the big one, fear. We are fearful of those that are different to us often, and those that we don't trust. So the other side of that, though, is would we have more violence if we weren't trusting? If we were distrustful, would we be more prone to acting violently at a slight provocation rather than dismissing that and maybe believing it to be a result of a misunderstanding, for example, or miscommunication? So trust serves us very well, but we do need to be at times cautious and have a level of awareness around who we are giving trust to. And of course, the big exemption to that is probably our narcissistic and psychopathic individuals. So essentially people that are interested in their own self-gain and act a certain way not because that's their genuine intention. It's because it's a self-serving or for self-serving reasons. But we won't go too much down that rabbit hole, probably only to caution that much of what we think about how people will act when they are telling the truth, or in fact not in telling the truth, doesn't apply to our narcissistic or psychopathic individuals. Now, I guess I would ask the students to think about, why might that not apply? So what could be a reason for psychopaths not having the same issue? And without jumping too much ahead, the answer lies in the experience of emotions. So we all feel anxiety, we all feel stress, we all have felt compassion. Most of us anyway have felt compassion and understanding of what it's like to be happy or sad or stressed, or even being accused of something. And that emotion plays a significant role. It often might grab you in the pit of your stomach. It might clutch at your throat and make it harder to speak. It's not there, though, for psychopathic individuals. So imagine if you didn't have emotional reactions. It does really change the circumstances and what you might do. So that's why things are different for psychopathic individuals. Now, Rebecca, what I thought we might just do before we finish up is a couple of things. One is to look at whether there's any takeaways that we can have moving forward. And we might, of course, just as well touch on the technology, about the development of that and what that's all going to mean for lie detection. But just before we get to that, we do have couple of questions that have been sent through, and it's around the role that a forensic psychologist plays in detecting deception. So can we pick things through word choice, voice tonality? And some of this we've touched on, but for example, a grieving spouse or parent giving an interview on television and pleading for their loved one to come home, but in actual fact, it's actually been the spouse that has murdered the person that they're pleading for to come home. In that situation, can we tell from a TV interview whether there are cues that the person's lying?
Again, that's hard, because I always think of the McCanns and Lindy Chamberlain. I mean, and still lots of people think that they did do it, and they're very stoic. And yet it's something that, like, if everybody you can find on YouTube, I'm sure, crocodile tears. And the people that had done it, like, they didn't cry. That was one that people were saying, wouldn't you be upset? And they didn't cry. And, they just didn't behave as you would think that you would behave in that situation. So that is something that works sometimes, but not in others. So it is very hard. And then I know for me, I've watched people, and over the years, and the recent case in Melbourne, and I straight away thought he'd done it. He didn't want to. His daughter was, really distressed. He didn't want to talk, and he talked around it, and he just didn't look distressed. But there's, statistically, there's a good chance that someone did do it, because these people seem to get on TV and talk about it and try and convince people. So, well, it works in some cases, it doesn't. I think it's just so hard to tell, because we don't know when we're grieving, when we're something as big as your partner going missing or your child, how we think we're going to act doesn't mean that's what we'll do when our body is flooded with, all these hormones. And that, so in one way you can tell, if you watch Crocodile Tears, some of them, it is so blatantly obvious that it's just terrible acting. So the things I'm going to say, okay, look for that, pretending to cry, you know, like this, and you've got no tears, and like, honestly, this woman on one of the crocodile tears, and they were horrific. They set the house on fire, and it was her partner's kids, 5 of them, burnt them all to death. Horrific.
Mm.
And they sat in front of the cameras. They got all this money. They're very poor people, neither of them working. All this money, and everything they were doing was just not consistent with what you would think. But the woman was actually, they're doing the interview, and she's got her head down. She's like, and it was just such bad acting. Anybody could have picked that out.
Mm.
But, you know, there's the problem. So go and look at them. All the clips are there. But we do tend to focus on that as like a confirmation bias. See, that's right, without looking at the other people that didn't do that, or the lady that laughed. So, yeah, what do you think? I mean, you work in the field. What do you think?
Look, I think it is very difficult to answer, as you're saying, and without sitting on the fence too much. The answer for me is a maybe. But it's definitely not a yes, and it's definitely not a no. And again, why I say maybe is because, yes, in some instances, it's more obvious, as you're saying, in some of those cases. But, you know, for example, we can look at the Morecambe. So in the case of Daniel Morecambe, and, you know, no doubt there were times where you could have watched the Morecambes being interviewed, and after maybe 12 to 18 months, their response to questions is different. So they've had time to sit with the grief. They've also probably maybe have more of what I would say is a blunted affect. So they're less emotional, they're less responsive. In some ways, it could seem that they are a bit more unemotional, and that can also be a symptom of grief as well, is that lack of emotional expression. So I think you could have watched the Morecambes being interviewed at times and had questions about their involvement. But as we saw, and I think most people realised, that they had no involvement. But basing judgments on interviews can be very misleading. And what I would probably say when I do say maybe is it's about picking up the inconsistencies and then delving further, but not reaching an opinion solely on an interview. Because I think that's dangerous, particularly a television interview. And, you know, I've spoken to the class about Gerard Baden Clay, and, you know, his interview was reasonably compelling about his wife being missing. He was pretty, you know, at least he appeared distressed, for example. But again, you can't solely rely on that interview. You've got to have a lot more things line up, and that might be in many ways the take-home message from this is it's about identifying inconsistencies, but then looking at what other behaviours line up. Because getting a conviction is not just about picking up an inconsistency in an interview. It's about lining up other evidence and other support that provides greater context and greater depth for your judgment and decision making. So I think it's an investigative lead. It's an avenue to explore. It's an avenue to narrow down your focus and attention on, and then probe and prod that further and see what unravels from there, but don't make a judgment at that point. And, you know, I guess another point that we've got down here is a person declaring their innocence during a police interview. Well, look, I've certainly done psychological assessments where people have been incarcerated and they are professing their innocence still. And the reality is you never know the truth. You don't know whether they may have been a wrongful conviction. So all you can do from a psychological assessment point of view is present both sides of the story. Your job's not to make an opinion about whether they are guilty or innocent. I guess one aspect is, first of all, they've been convicted. So you're working with the fact that they have been convicted for that offence. But of course, you can present both arguments. You can present the argument that they were convicted and this is the evidence that's been against them. And then you can, of course, present what they are saying. And ultimately, then that is up to another party to decide, whether that's a judge, whether that's a parole board. And I guess one view is that that's, you know, pushing the responsibility onto someone else. But in many instances, you're not the person that's being asked to make that decision or that judgment. Yes, if you're a police officer and you're looking at charging someone and you're investigating the case, then again, you've got to make a judgment, but you're also not the only person that's making that decision. You're saying that there is substantial evidence against this person, therefore we're moving forward with charges. And then it's up to a judge or a jury to weigh that evidence and make a decision based on that. So again, it is looking at the evidence and not making a conclusive judgment. And ultimately, you would hope that through the process, it works. But of course, sometimes the process breaks down. The other question that's been asked is around a ransom and suicide note. And can you tell from that? So do you have any thoughts there, Rebecca?
Well, if the students just go on to Google Images and look up the John Benet Ramsey note,
Yes.
that's such an interesting one to read through, and that's been heavily analysed. I think that's a great thing if your students were to look at that, and then even like on the discussion board, what do you pick out? Because there are things in that ransom letter, the fact of how the conditions under which it was written in of itself are extremely interesting. But yeah, I reckon your students should look through that and you print it out, circle what doesn't seem right, because there's some fascinating aspects of these ransom notes. What do you think with that one? I think there's definitely things in there, like, I probably shouldn't give it away, just some of the words. What era, what age group are you looking at? I do think there's things you can really pull out of there that are very telling. Punctuation, things that you don't. I looked at, as someone who grades papers all the time, I looked at it and thought, gee, the punctuation's good. The way that paragraph is set out tells me this is someone who's done it with the paragraph, with grammar being perfect with unusual words, but then purposely misspelling. It seemed to me purposely misspelling a really simple word, yet using other words that are very well, they're spelt correctly. And then something else looks purposeful, but the thing to me was the punctuation and the formatting. That indicates to me that someone's educated.
I think that to me is a very intriguing area. Essentially, we're looking at statement analysis and linguistic analysis. And I mean, I don't have a conclusive answer around whether it is any more reliable than all the other approaches that we've just discussed. I do believe, though, that it does certainly give you telltales. But again, what do those telltales mean?
Yeah, it doesn't mean they did it. That's the thing. That's the thing.
And I think that the language side, yes, it is very interesting. It does, as Rebecca's saying, you do see inconsistencies, and it raises questions around why this word has been used and why there's punctuation, but there's a misspelling. And it's certainly intriguing, and there are a handful of experts around in linguistic analysis. It's something that if I had more time, I would love to study further. I think it's a fascinating field, and we've seen as well, particularly in the field of profiling, where instances like Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and of course we had the Mad Bomber as well, where these individuals have communicated with police, and their language has been crucial to getting an understanding about the perpetrator. And it's often, particularly in the Unabomber case, it was pivotal to identify who the perpetrator was. So it's one of those areas where it has certainly utility, but again, is it a concrete absolute? No, it's not. And I think it's something that we may see that with technology, that there's some room for identifying greater patterns in language use, but it's still an evolving area. But it's scientific, but it's also art at the same time.
Yeah, and it is. And as we know, in our field, you know, people will be used as expert witnesses in a field that's not really regulated. It's not well funded. We publish stuff without, you know, if you critique something, it's not as likely to be published. All the forensic science reports from the US and UK have looked at all these different things and been like, we've got no error rate. We don't, you know, we can't give you a probability. A lot of scientists, we've all got biases. I'm very biased that I'm correct in when I'm saying there is no, what they call the Pinocchio's nose. I could be dead wrong. I keep going, in fact, I have been plenty of times. I keep going down this path. My bias is this is being misused, and we've got scientific reports that support that. We don't have this known error rate for a lot of things, and we have confirmation bias ourselves, and lay people assume that linguistic analysis, if you're getting an expert, that this is 100% correct, and we don't know that. And anything that can be changed. So if you and I now are plotting a murder, Nathan, and we're looking at John Bonet and we know what we picked up on, clever psychopath, it's all out there. Especially now on the internet, it's all out there. So what we'll do is we'll write a note, really bad grammar, and you know, we won't use any words that indicate I may have, you know, had my heyday in the 80s. We won't use any of that. We'll use, you know, jargon that we would find with someone of a different race. So if you're an intelligent, if I was a copper and I was sitting there interviewing someone, the first thing I'd want to do is anything I could to figure out if this person was a psychopath. And if I could do anything to figure it out straight away, I'd be thinking, we got half a dozen suspects. This guy or this gal is a psychopath. It would bias me, but I think I'd be on a percentage rate. I'd be more likely if there's a handful of people that may have done it, but we've got this one is a psychopath. That's the one I'd be looking at, and that's the one that I wouldn't trust anything, and I'd be scrutinising, because I just think percentage-wise, I'd have a higher likelihood that it was this guy. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in a lot of forensic work, psychopathy is the X factor.
Yeah.
And my view, particularly having, you know, focused on that area so much, is that you generally want, I like to take the approach of starting with, is the person a psychopath?
Yeah, that's what I'd do. If I was a police officer, I'd want to know that before I knew anything else. Because
the reason behind that is you've got essentially two different ways of responding. You're going to have someone that's emotional versus someone that's not emotional. And there's very different approaches that will be taken, and also different reasoning from an investigative point of view that you'll need depending on either of those. And particularly if you can exclude psychopathy, then it allows you to take more of a considered approach and question a lot of these things that are faulty assumptions around whether a person's lying, for example, like eye contact. So if you know that the person isn't psychopathic, well, they're going to experience anxiety, fear, and uncertainty during the interview process. So you factor that into your judgment and decision making. So it is important to know who is the person that's sitting in front of you. Now, I just want to flag one more thing, Rebecca, is technology. And for me, technology is very concerning on this front. You know, even the fact that there's multi-million dollar funding underway at the moment in the States, and I'm not sure what other jurisdictions as well, or other countries, but this facial recognition aspect that is going to be rolled out widespread. And I was at a conference in Melbourne earlier this year where essentially there's the idea around using facial recognition, for example, to prevent lone act of violence. So it's essentially looking at, we will have cameras everywhere, and the person that is displaying the basically the odd one out. So if their facial expressions or emotion on their face is a mismatch to the other individuals around them, then that can be what is constituted as a warning behavior. Now, I think that's fascinating in theory, but hugely problematic, because is it the Minority Report? I mean, are we going down that path where we're making judgments on someone based on pre-crime? So they are showing the expression, or they're showing disgust at these other individuals that they are in the room with, and therefore we need to intervene and arrest them before they carry out the crime, or they may be on a trajectory to carry out a crime. I think it's worrying. I think it's a fascinating area, but my gosh, if that gets rolled out without the due diligence that's needed, and as you've said, so many approaches are rolled out without there being any scientific underpinnings, that the reality is it's probably likely to get rolled out. And again, we'll be making these judgments based on faulty science.
The fMRI, they launched the business, No Lie MRI, good name, and CFOS. And this actually was presented to the courts but not accepted. And this was fMRI lie detection. So they put you in the big machine and they get you to press a button, yes or no to something, and they basically brain scan you, sort of like a X-ray but moving parts, because they said there are 3 areas of your brain that are activated when you're lying, based on 4 studies, and the studies recognise the limitations. These sort of expensive, I think fMRI machine, $6 million. These expensive studies often have very low participant numbers. So you'll see fMRI studies that had 6 people in them. But anyway, so 3 areas are activated. So they presented it to the court with a doctor who was accused of Medicare fraud. So the first time it came out that he was lying, but then he said, oh, I was very tired, so we need to do it again in the morning. And then the next time it said he was telling the truth. And it was thrown out. There wasn't sign. The judge said, what if we do it again this afternoon? Will it say that he's lying? But it was rolled out with this idea that, and heaps of problems with the research, but based on 4 studies, that 3 areas are activated. So you've got 3 problems there. Research design, small numbers, and you're going to assume that's with everyone. Something, is made into a business then and sold. But there's a problem legally. What does this do to your right to silence? So your right to your own brain, your right to, to not say anything that will incriminate you. And a huge problem is there's a couple of young guys from Harvard, and they sort of kicked off this MRI study with lying. And it was very exciting because they found that you had this more activation in your prefrontal cortex when you were lying than when you were telling the truth. Then they realized, with interviewing people later, the people that they put on the lie list, if someone considers lying and they don't, you can't tell. So you've got this, and it ties in with cognitive load theory. So people consider lying but then they don't, and they just tell the truth. And we've all seen, you know, YouTube it, police interviews where people lie, and then they tell the truth. Or someone can consider it. You might be going to interview me about something, and I think, geez, I was in the area. Or, geez, that guy's dead. And I told people, you know, my ex-husband's dead, and I told people I wish he was dead. And then you go and brain scan me, and I think, maybe I should not tell them that I told people I wish they were dead. Maybe I shouldn't tell them that I was in that area. So if I've got all that going through my head and you brain scan me, I will come out with this activation in these 3 areas that were strong. I considered lying to you, but I told you the truth. And sometimes with cognitive load, telling the truth can be higher in the circumstance. If you imagine it, if you're the cop, Nathan, and I'm sitting here, I think, all right, I'm going to confess. I've also got going through my head, I'm going to go to prison. What's going to happen to my children? What will happen, you know, to everybody else? I'm just going to fess up. You brain scan me and I have all this going on.
Mm.
So in a way, it's an amazing finding that we've got 3 particular areas that always light up. But again, it's these other variables that I do think that we're going to find something eventually, and it'll be, we need to step away from behavior. Anything you can control, writing a note, how you act, you've only got to look. I would actually, if I was interviewed, consider doing the things that I know aren't consistent with lying, but that I also know that everybody else thinks is. I would hold eye contact if I was with a cop, even though it wouldn't be my natural reaction, because I'd want you to think I was telling the truth. So I think one day we're going to find something via brain scanning. Once we get good enough at it, I think that will be the way we go. And I think it'll have to be, because I don't think we'll ever find one behavioural thing. If it can be controlled, we're in trouble. So I do think it's a future, and so do a lot of other people, but we've only just dipped our toes in the water, and we're yet to separate the other variables.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think we will come up with things that are more functional and that are more reliable and that do have some evidence of error rates. Again, will it be generalizable though? That will be the challenge. And I guess without coming back to psychopathy too much again, we might find that we've got something that's generally generalizable to most people, but it's the exceptions, the ones that can control their responses, that are going to potentially not come up on the brain scan because they don't have the same emotional processes. And I think that's essentially the challenge, is that we're trying to develop something that's generalizable for a group that isn't generalizable. And that is our biggest issue moving forward. And as you're saying, you know, it's worrying when you have to consider changing your normal behavior in a police interview because you believe that if you don't, you'll be perceived as lying. And I think that is a very concerning position that we're in if that is the case. And unfortunately, I think many people probably feel that way when they're being interviewed. And of course, without, you know, putting all of this back on the police and saying, well, it's their fault and it's their poor interview practices, I think it just highlights the nature of emotion and what stress does in a situation. And even if the police had good interviewing practices, could they account for the fact that a person is going to suddenly reverse their behavior and do something completely different to what they normally do when they're placed in that situation? And again, even if they could, one person may do it and another person doesn't. So it becomes incredibly complex and challenging for the police. And probably the approach that I think is most effective is the process of continually refining and narrow down the point, or narrow down the aspect where you get these inconsistencies, and keep going, keep working your way down till you get to a point where it can be eliminated. And I think, Rebecca, you've said before that when police don't bring in these problematic judgments and biases, that they do actually do their job very well. It's when they start to bring psychology in without having the proper expertise that we get problems. And look, they're probably bringing in to the police interviewing general human confirmation biases and attributional errors. And I think probably the message that we're saying is that they can't afford to do that. They need a clinical approach where it is very pragmatic, it's very structured, and it's systematic. Because if it isn't, and they do bring in their own views and think they are having expertise in this area, it can be really problematic.
I couldn't agree with that statement more. It's not the problem. Our interviewing, from what I've read in Australia, is very good. It's a more tempered, based on the UK model, not the very dangerous, read techniques that have led to all these, incorrect incarcerations. I think the hard part is we don't realise we can't leave ourselves at the door. So it's not like, it sounds like, I think a lot of things, it sounds like bagging up police when it is totally not. I think it's a lack of understanding that we cannot leave ourselves at the door. Police people are people. They've got a background, they've got a history, they make implicit impressions the same as I do it, and I understand it. I'm sure you do it, Nathan, and we understand it. But it's that human factor that I think is the problem. It's, the irony is, I think if you follow the police process, you're much more likely to get it correct. If you can take out your humanness, which is impossible just about, but at least having an understanding of it can help you to check yourself. Okay, no, let's go back. This is what I should be doing. I think that definitely works the best. I think the one interesting thing with brain scanning is we could use that to find out if someone's a psychopath, because we can put up these things, we can ask them fear-inducing. If we've got 5 suspects and we put them all in an fMRI and we monitor their amygdala activity, everyone who's not a psychopath will likely have, when we ask them the questions, will have amygdala activity when we show them a scary picture. Now, that is something that, the Navy SEALs have trained to try and control their amygdala activity. Unless you're a Navy SEAL who's gone through that training, that's something that we can't control and we can't fake, is amygdala activity. If we've got a psychopath in there, it's not going to happen. And I think using that reverse approach would probably work better than trying to find, are they lying about this question? But if we see someone who's got amygdala activity, we know all their behaviour is going to be fear-based. Someone who doesn't have it, okay, we're not confusing these behaviours with fear anymore. So that's my thought on it. But, when are we going to have a world, and it wouldn't be allowed, okay, hey, you're all suspects. Now here's let's roll out our fMRI machine. We're just going to put you on here and show you a scary picture. And if your amygdala is not activated, you're our #1 suspect. However, I think that would work because it's physiology. It's not anything else. Your amygdala will either be activated or it won't.
Yes. Yeah. And look, who knows where we will go down that path, but no doubt we potentially in the next decade or two will see that suspects may be strapped to something. What exactly that is, it will be we'll have to wait and see, but it's heading that way. Yes.
EEGs can be embedded in headrests.
Yeah.
And an EEG will pick up your brain activity, can't do the structure, but it can get the general area and the type of activity. They've been embedded in headrests by car companies in Europe to test when people are getting drowsy. Technically, if we can pick up something, we can just have you and say, okay, sit back. I want you to sit back, relax, lay your head back and tell me everything you remember. And we could be picking up things from your visual system technically.
Well, on that note, maybe we should wrap up. I think maybe the message there is that Sigmund Freud had it right all along with his couch. So we're just going to embed it.
We're going to go back there just in a different way.
Pop an EEG into it, have the suspect lie down on the therapy couch, and we'll be working out whether they're lying or not.
Yeah.
Well, Rebecca, thank you. I'm sure the class will find it invaluable for your input today, and hopefully they can look into some of those things that you've mentioned.
Yeah. You're more than welcome. You know, it's my favorite topic and you need to shut me off. So, yeah.